we are welcoming to Father Sirico. Hi, Father, how are you? We
Very
are
well,
very
thank you.
that you be with us. I led you with Álvaro Iriarte, that is our director on research of Respublica, that will be the host of this second part of this seminary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us today in this special day. To all of you that are just connecting to this transmission, we have it on Zoom, and we actually have it too live on YouTube. We are commemorating the centenary of John Paul II. And on this time, I believe it's the first time you are participating in a Chilean host event. Am I right, Father? Before the presentation, I believe it's the first time, right?
Well, I have been to Chile several times,
okay.
Spoken in various venues, but this is the first time I'm doing it virtually. So it's
I know.
my morning in Chile. I was having breakfast and I said to my companion priest that I was going to Chile for the morning. So I'm glad to be with you.
Well, so Father Robert Sirico is the co-founder of Acton Institute based on Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a think tank working on ideas of economic freedom within the moral framework of traditional Christian teaching, especially Catholic teaching, but open to all Western civilization. He co-founded the institute in 1990, and Father Sirico has been writing on religious, political, and economic issues, as well as social matters, and he has been published on different journals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the London Financial Times, the Washington Times, and National Review. And we are glad to host him here today to speak about John Paul II and the economy. So, Father, please.
Thank you very much. I want to say again how delighted I am to be with you all, and especially on this day. I was thinking of John Paul and the meetings I had with him and the work that I did during his pontificate, especially in conjunction with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, and the then saintly Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan, who was responsible for the compilation of the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. I remember vividly the funeral of John Paul II and the calls for him to be made a saint immediately, Santo Subito, and then also the calls for him to be called John Paul the Great. In fact, I generally refer to him in that way. So what I'd like to do for my presentation is just give some background on why he is unique, particularly to the social question, and then touch on a number of the themes. It's very difficult in a few moments. We have about 25 minutes to cover the vast corpus of his thinking, even on just the social teaching of the church, let alone his initiatives in other areas. But these are well worth our contemplation today. I suppose that one of the things that we should have in mind before us is the uniqueness of his own life experience. It was an utter shock to the world that in 1978, a Slavic Pope should be elected. Remember, it had been hundreds of years since there had been a non-Italian Pope. It was just an assumption you would have an Italian. And now we haven't had a non-Italian or an Italian since John Paul. But the uniqueness, not just of him not being an Italian, but of his having lived under two of the most totalitarian regimes, certainly in the 20th century, arguably in history, by which, of course, I'm referring to fascism, the rise of National Socialism out of Germany, which dominated so much of Poland, at a very critical time in his own life, in his formation as a priest, and then, of course, under communism, a different form of socialism. And I think this, along with his own philosophical studies, formed in the soul of this man a deep and profound understanding that, frankly, we're just now beginning to unpack. And we need to renew a focus on his writings in this regard, because the first thing we need to understand about John Paul II is his personalism. That is, the understanding that so much of his theology, and especially his social teaching, comes out of his understanding of the human person, created unique, unrepeatable, with an intrinsic dignity, never to be subordinated to mechanisms outside of conscience and the truth. And that anthropological vision formed in him the notion, or created in him an assumption, that the human person must be free to act. And this was true not just in his social teaching, but in his pastoral life. I heard many stories of people who had been to confession to him. And one of the repeated bits of advice that came out of that confessional was decide. You must decide. The priest, the confessor, can't decide for you. The sense of this understanding of human autonomy, this understanding, the sphere of human freedom, becomes the occasion for the discovery of virtue. And he constructed then an entire social teaching predicated on this notion of the human person first and foremost. So let me just walk through a few aspects of his contribution to the church's social teaching, first by reminding everyone that, and John Paul does this in a number of places in his writings, that the social teaching of the church is not a political platform. It is not a set of ideological policies. It is not a third way between liberal capitalism and socialism. Very often the church's teaching has been seen in this light. He says very explicitly in a number of places, but most particularly in his encyclical Solicitudo Socis Realis, that in number 41, that it is not a third way, it is not an ideology, and that what the church's social teaching is a reflection on the dignity of the human person and a whole other way of doing or confronting the social question. So I think this is a very important part. Any ideology in the mind of John Paul the Great that would subordinate the dignity of the human person to a system or an ideology is not worthy of man. That's what John Paul would say. So this certainly manifestly applies to any form of National Socialism, to fascism. And there's a great universal consensus on that. But he also says that it applies to socialism, especially what he called real socialism. Remember, he lived under the dominance of Soviet communism and saw the effects of that. It's interesting to me, by the way, that when John Paul was elected, initially, people thought, because of his knowledge of Marxism, which is evident in a number of his encyclicals and in speeches, they thought this would be the opening to a new Christian socialist dialogue. And in fact, it was, but not in the way that they anticipated. They really thought that he would bring a kind of Christian perspective through the lens of Marxism. And these are people who were sadly mistaken, as it became very apparent very soon. The communists knew that on the election of John Paul II that they were in for trouble. On the plane of international relations and politics, they knew that he was quite willing to confront intelligently, calmly, in a very informed way, the indignities that people had to suffer, particularly workers had to suffer under the communist regime. And this understanding, this activism that became activism in Poland and then spread, of course, throughout the world, again was animated by this anthropological vision. Time and time again in the social teaching of John Paul II, which we find not just in the great encyclical Centesimus Annus, which I'll note, but also in Laborums Exercens and Solicitudo Rei Socialis. These various encyclicals, among other allocutions, letters, homilies that he preached, all go back to this question of anthropology. And I think you simply will not understand the social teaching of this pontificate if you don't understand that about it. So let me just then point out a number of features of, or not just features, but kind of pillars of his social teaching. I've already talked about the anthropological, the social, or the intrinsic dignity of the human person. But then how does this play itself out in the social sphere? And so, and let me back up for just a moment. So there is this anthropological and theological critique of fascism and of communism, but also of materialist capitalism. And so his critiques of capitalism, his critiques of the capitalist culture, what he calls the capitalist culture, are very interesting and nuanced, highly nuanced, and I think very often ripped out of their context to be made to say that he was against the free economy. There could be nothing further from the truth when you read his writings, and now I'll go through some of them to show you that he really enables us who believe in the free society. I believe in a free market. I think the free market is the most efficient way in which we can produce wealth for people. But he gives us a way of critiquing aspects of the free market and avoiding making the mistakes of ideologizing a free economy. This was his corrective. He said, we need a free economy, but we can't make an ideology out of it. It has to come out of human interaction. Free human initiative is the phrase that he uses repeatedly in a number of encyclicals. So let me say that one of the pillars of his teaching is the kind of retrieval and amplification of a traditional Catholic principle called the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the notion that needs are best met at the most local level of their existence. And particularly in the encyclical Centesimus Annus, you have an extensive set of paragraphs that outline what this means. It means, and you see some assumptions operative in this section of that encyclical and his definition of subsidiarity, that needs are both best met at the most local level of their existence, but the recognition that the human person is both individual and social also enables us to understand that sometimes human beings fail in taking care of themselves or find themselves in a dilemma of one sort or another, of their own making, or of a physical malady that befalls them, whatever it happens to be, that other means, other networks of people should come around that person to be supportive. And what he says is the first responders ought to be those closest to this person. So it would be the family, or the network of social arrangements like a parish or a neighborhood association or civic organizations in society, what we call in English the mediating institutions, those institutions that mediate between the individual and the state. And then he allows for state intervention in cases of urgent need. This is again coming right out of the encyclical. And what he means by that the first actors there again should be those most proximate to the people in need. This is a section of the encyclical where he is critiquing the social assistance state, or what we call in the West the welfare state. And he said that these levels of society should begin at the lowest level, at the level most proximate, and that there can be interventions even at higher levels of social organization. But here's the thing that I think people run past very quickly. These should only be done in cases of urgent need, manifest need, and they should be temporary. They shouldn't be seen as a substitute, but as a help. And in point of fact, the word subsidiarity comes from the Latin subsidium, which means to help. It's this notion of assisting a person to the point that they no longer need assistance. And then he says, and he says it very explicitly, this, by the way, is all in the, I think it's the 42nd and 43rd sections of or maybe the 48th section, number of the encyclical, 48. He said, then those spheres of society, the natural spheres of society, among which he includes business, should come back into the normative process of assisting people in their needs. This is a very key thing. So subsidiarity, and let's keep in mind subsidiarity is a complementary principle to the principle of solidarity. Solidarity, of course, becomes very famous worldwide with the movement of in Poland, Solidarność, the anti-communist union movement. This was particularly galling to the communists, to think that people who were workers were going to protest communism. And I think here you have this wonderful complementarity. So it's not a corrective, but it's a complementary set of principles, subsidiarity and solidarity, both ways in which the human person, the dignity of the human person can be protected. So you have subsidiarity, you have the rejection of the welfare state, and you have the recognition of the efficiencies of markets. I mean, more than anyone, any pope, and more than some economists, John Paul talks about the efficiency of the market. And he just says it as it is more and more acknowledged that the market, the free market, is the most efficient way in which human needs are met. And so he acknowledges that. And then, while this isn't brand new in Catholic social thought, it certainly is not emphasized enough. He says that the church recognizes the legitimate role of profit in society. Now, for the economists who are participating in this conference, that should not be a surprise, that the role of profit is a good thing. For any, in my estimation, any reasonable person, profit should not be seen as a surprise. But I think the ones who have the real problem with this are theologians, religious leaders with good intentions. I remember I was asked at a conference once, Father, do you believe that profit making in business is moral? And I said, it's certainly more moral than the making of losses in a business enterprise. Why would you go into enterprise? Why would you do anything without the goal of profiting? That is to say, to achieve what you set out to do. That is what a profit is. It means that you have accomplished in business what you set out to do. You don't have to plan for losses. All you have to do to make a loss in a business is do nothing or do it poorly, and you can make plenty of losses. And this idea that profits are morally acceptable under the right conditions, of course. I suppose you could say that a thief makes a profit by stealing money from somebody else, but in an economic sense, that's not a profit. That's an apprehension or a redistribution of wealth rather than the creation of wealth. The profit in an economic sense is the creation of wealth. And that's another aspect of this encyclical. I'm referring to Centesimus Annus repeatedly simply because it's a kind of condensation of his thinking, John Paul's thinking on economics, drawn from his other previous encyclicals, and of course written on the momentous occasion of the collapse of real socialism in Central Europe. So it's the 100th anniversary of the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which Leo XIII wrote, and then 100 years later, in 1990, John Paul will write this encyclical in a very similar way. He says in Centesimus Annus that what he is doing is rereading Leo XIII, given the context of the fall of real socialism. And then he, more than any other pope, addresses the question of business. He says that business and entrepreneurship throws back onto Christianity a light. In other words, business enables Christianity to understand the practical dimensions of its own vocation. Think about what that means. He is saying that the church can learn from the practice of business. He uses the word entrepreneur in that encyclical more than any pope ever did and ever has even since. Of course, it's just a few pontificates later, but so we can still hope that there will be others to elaborate this point. So what I want to do now, if I may, is just read to you what I think is kind of the heart of the encyclical. It's when he is addressing the question, he's really kind of summarizing the whole of his encyclical. Remember that he's gone through now and talked about the fall of communism, about the various principles necessary for the free society, the dignity of the human person, all of this. And then he kind of pauses now to recapitulate in number 42 of Centesimus Annus. He returns to the whole question that he's proposing in this encyclical. And so he says, and I'm just going to read two paragraphs, a little more extensive than I would normally like to do in a talk, but it's really well worth meditating on because I think a lot of people for some of you, this may be the first time you've heard an extensive discussion of John Paul II on the occasion of the centenary. And so I want to make sure that you know this, we say, gravamen, the kind of heart, the foundation of this encyclical. He says, returning now to the initial question, listen to this question. Can it perhaps be said that after the failure of communism, capitalism is the victorious social system, and that capitalism should be the goal of the countries now making efforts to rebuild their economy and society? That's the question. Is this the model which ought to be proposed to the countries of the third world, which are searching for a path to true economic and civil progress? So this is the aftermath of the colossal wreck of socialism. And he's saying, do we recommend this capitalism to these nations that are coming out from under communism? Do we recommend this to the developing world? And here's his answer. And it's very important that you get what he is saying here. The answer, he says, is obviously complex. And he proposes two forms of capitalism now. If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, that is in private property and in private hands, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, if this is what you mean by capitalism, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative. The answer is yes. Even though it's better if you would speak of a business economy, a market economy, or simply a free economy. He doesn't like the word capitalism, and neither do I, because it's associated with Marxism. And it's too narrow. It's just talking about capital. And there's so much more to a free economy than that dimension. Then he offers an alternative form of capitalism. But if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality. See, he doesn't see human freedom as just economic freedom, but as so much more. Again, this return to the dignity of the person, and sees this particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is negative. In other words, if you're just talking about materialism, if you're just talking about a free market, if you're just talking about an economic system that has no reference to law, the rule of law, and no reference to ethics or even religion, then that is a negative form of capitalism because it is as materialistic as communism. So let me just stop there and say that what we have in John Paul II is I think one of the most monumental thinkers in the 20th century, which is why I think he should be acclaimed John Paul the Great. I mean, this man, there's so much more to be said than just the economic dimension to this man. But he lays down the foundation from which we can construct a society that is both free and virtuous, that we don't have to choose between a kind of libertine notion of the free society and the moral society, that we can have both. We can have a free society that also lives according to the principles of ethics and religious animation. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to a wide-ranging discussion with our audience.
So thank you, Father Sirico. So just to remind our viewers, we are hosting this seminar commemorating the centennial of John Paul II. This is organized by Instituto Respublica, and we have the sponsor and collaboration of the Chilean Christian Businessmen Association, member of UNIAPAC. And actually, we're going to open our question and answer, Q&A, as we will call it in English. The first one is one from this Association of Businessmen. So we have recorded that question, and we're going to play it now.
Sergio Merino, chairman of USEC, a Christian Businessmen Association in Chile. We are partner of Uniapar International. Father Robert, I would like to ask you what Pope John Paul, if alive, would tell to businessmen about how to behave in this pandemic and the economic crisis that would certainly come after it. Thanks.
That's a deep, provocative question. From what I can see and what he has written, there would be two things. The first is that he would say that business people need to be at the forefront of the resolution to this pandemic, in their research, in their ability to produce the kinds of things we need, whether that happens to be masks or gowns or the kind of vaccines and medication that we need to resolve this issue, that he would say that business people are going to be the first responders to this, the most intelligent responders to this. Even if you want to have a role for the government in it, the government's going to have to turn to the people, the entrepreneurs who are producing the medicines and the vaccines, who run the research laboratories. That would be the first thing that he would say, that you have to get to work. This is your vocation. The second thing he would say is that the government ought to be far more modest in the role that it assumes in this crisis. It's not to say that there shouldn't be a role for government in this, as we see in his delineation on the principle of subsidiarity, but that the role of the government should not crowd out the kind of research and entrepreneurial activity that is going to help to resolve and ameliorate the situation that people are in. The other thing, and I certainly don't want to put words in the mouth of the Pope, because, you know, I can only draw principles out from what he said. He's not alive at this moment, so we can't say he would say this or he would say that. But in Centésimos Annos, John Paul calls for a stable monetary system. And in this regard, I think we have to confront what I would say have been the imprudent decisions. Now I'm really kind of pointing the finger at the United States here, though I should imagine that this is applicable in other countries as well. But it frightens me to think what something on the order of $5 trillion that has been thrown at this problem is going to mean for the stability of our currency and the stability of our economy as a whole. If we're acting on behalf of preserving human life, then we have to understand the role of economics in the preservation of that. It's not a choice between our health and our economy. Healthy economies produce healthy people because they make for the kinds of drugs that remedy the problems, the kind of sanitation, the kind of service to sustain human life. So this choice that many politicians seem to be proposing between you know, a healthy economy or healthy society is, I think, a false dichotomy. And everything I know about the writings of John Paul II tell me that.
Okay. Oh, Father, we have our first question from the audience. They are sending them in Spanish, so I'm translating it. I hope to do it the best possible way. But one of our guests asked you regarding what you were speaking at the end of your speech. What does John Paul II mean when he states that capitalism or free market must not be understood as an ideology?
So I think what he's talking about is a narrow form, a narrow way of thinking and seeing everything through one lens. An ideology is, well, you know, I think it's in philosophy that we say to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you know, because that's the function of the hammer. And the problem with economists, the problem with capitalists, is in understanding for instance, the importance of the role of profit, is to think that the only important thing is profit. The theme that John Paul comes back to time and time again in this encyclical and throughout his pontificate was to see human freedom in its whole context, so that the economic dimension of human life is true, and the principles that undergird that are not detachable from it. So for instance, supply and demand, you can't talk about economics without talking about supply and demand. These are true, but they're not the whole truth. That there's something else about the human person that comes into play, and that there are times where profit or supply and demand don't apply, that human beings have needs that are not just economic needs. You can't buy love. You can't buy friendship. People try to do this all the time. And it's not to say there isn't an overlap with some of these questions, but to think that human life and the human person can be satisfied ultimately simply by a free economy, by a prosperous economy, is a truncated, and I would say ideological, way of approaching the question of the market. The market serves a function. The market gives us truths about supply and demand, about the cost of doing business, of transporting goods, of developing products, and all of that. Those are true things. But that's not the whole truth of who human beings are. There are some things that we need that exceed the market. And also, an ideology of capitalism would justify any market activity as long as it's free. And a moral vision, a non-ideological vision, would say no, that there are some things that can be sold on a market that should not be sold on a market, like human beings. That would be a great example of it. I mean, there were markets for human beings, and they went, you know, if you were stronger, you could demand more money for a stronger slave and less money for a weaker slave. And the fact that you could calculate that economically doesn't mean that it should be.
Okay, Father, we have another question. This one is related to the topic, like social teachings regarding business and economic freedom or free market. What are the similarities and main differences we can see in the pontificates of John Paul II and Pope Francis?
Well, I see a few acknowledgements. I don't know if they're direct acknowledgements on the part of Pope Francis to John Paul, but certainly to some of the ideas that John Paul has about the importance of business. We see that Francis, even in his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, mentions the importance of business and the way in which business is necessary to resolve certain ecological problems. The difference, however, is that I don't see the kind of anthropological depth in Francis that I see in John Paul II. I see a great sentiment, a great emotive response in Francis's heart toward the vulnerable. I sense that what he wants to do is assure those who are on the margins of the love of the church for them. John Paul did this in other ways. Of course, John Paul was a philosopher and a profound thinker, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Pope Francis strikes me as a pastor, as one who first and foremost wants to love people and bring them into association, and hopefully by that association with the church and with Christ, heal the various wounds. I don't think for Pope Francis, the questions are the same set of questions that John Paul had to confront. I think their life experiences were vastly different as well. So there's a certain compatibility, but a certain contrast as well.
Okay. Remember, we remember all our guests that you are able to send the questions you want to ask Father Robert Sirico today in this seminar commemorating the centennial of John Paul II, organized by Instituto Res Publica. Father, another question goes like this. Why do you think that in countries like Latin American ones, the moral dimension or the ethic dimension of free economy is always really difficult to get, sometimes get lost, not like in the United States or other countries?
Well, this is an interesting question. In a way, it goes back to the question about Pope Francis, because I think being a Latin American, Pope Francis comes out of that experience. And what that experience is largely a mercantilist experience. That is a heavy confluence between the state and business. Now, there's a difference between the rule of law as the overarching context in which the economic process goes forward, and the amalgamation or the close association between the state and the economy, particularly state and businessmen. And so I think that the assumption in much of Latin America, this I say from my experience of being there a good number of times, is that the state should have a heavy hand in the guidance of business, and perhaps part of that comes out of the belief on the part of many business people that they should have a great say in the decisions of the state. So it's one hand washing the other. From my perspective as an American, but I'm an Italian American too, so I get Europe. I understand the European approach to these questions. But as an American, we see the demarcation much more clearly, that the economy does not have to be run by the state, that the function of the state is limited but definite, that there should be a role for the state in implementing and securing law, in safeguarding the right to private property, in safeguarding the right to personal initiative, that is human freedom in the economic sphere, and enforcing rights of contract. So these are very definite roles that the state has to have, but they're limited roles. I see in Latin America a greater interpenetration between the two. Let me also say that I think it would be better to go further back in the Latin tradition than the modern era, than the mercantilist era. And what I'm referring to here are the scholastics, particularly the scholastics of Salamanca, and that are virtually unknown and rarely referenced in Catholic social teaching, which is, I think, to the impoverishment of the social teaching of the church, as well as to Latin American economies. And you have it right there, written originally, well, in Latin, but also in Spanish. And Tomás de Mercado and a whole host of other disciples of St. Thomas Aquinas. So it's your tradition. It's not an Anglo tradition. This all happens before Adam Smith.
Well, that's a very interesting issue, and if you are aware, I mean, in Latin America, there is not too much study of the Salamanca school. I mean, actually, the only renown is Vitoria, due to the thing of the first earliest step of the Spanishization of America, but the rest it's almost forgotten and not even considered. Oh, right. Father, one last question. In 1987, in his trip to Chile, John Paul II gave a speech at CEPAL. It's very relevant because it's connected with one of the things you spoke earlier, and it's like the moral causes of prosperity. Do you think that today we have forgotten these moral causes? And we are trying to look for prosperity like something spontaneous?
Yes, that letter that he wrote to the Chilean, was it the Entrepreneurs Business Society that he wrote that letter to? I've forgotten the CEPAL. It was the
no,
group,
it's the United Nations. Yeah, the
yes.
United Nations Commissions for America, for
Right.
Latin American and the Caribbean.
He mentioned subsidiarity in that letter, and I think we have forgotten that. And the situation is somewhat different in Chile now than it was back in 1987, and I think that is very sad. The reason I think it's sad is because the real challenge now in society is not how to survive in terms of substance. We know how to produce enough goods and services for human life to survive. It's how to live morally in the context of abundance. Society will advance economically as long as people are free, but the moral question has to be brought to bear on how do we live in the midst of abundance. And by neglecting all of that, by focusing on something that we've really solved, that is how to produce wealth, we leave empty the whole question of how to live in the midst of wealth.
Okay, so in name of Instituto Res Publica and Chilean Businessmen Association, USEC, we thank you, Father Robert Sirico, for your time, for being with us today. We hope you can keep working on Acton Institute on the issues you are spreading, like all of these we have talked today, and we appreciate your time.
Gracias a todos. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Padre. Bien, y agradecemos a todos los que se han conectado a nuestro seminario Juan Pablo II por Zoom o por nuestra transmisión en YouTube, y les recordamos que esto va a quedar grabado y después va a quedar disponible en el canal de YouTube de República, al cual pueden suscribirse para ver este contenido y otros más. Y también a contar de ayer en las redes sociales y en la página de República está disponible precisamente la traducción en español oficial del discurso de Juan Pablo II en la CEPAL, que viene muy atingente a este evento. Y también le deseamos el mejor de los éxitos al Acton Institute, que está realizando la Acton University como todos los años, y este año será desde el 17 al 18 de junio. Father, if you just want to say anything regarding if you want to say anything regarding Acton University, it will be great.
Yes, I would like to. Let me invite people to come to the Acton website. we have some, Acton University has been going on now for 20 years, and usually it occurs here with over 1,000 participants in Grand Rapids. But this year, because of the pandemic and all of the, we are embracing a pivot. This phrase now has become, this word has become very popular. So our Acton University will be virtual. We haven't laid out everything because we're working on putting it together very feverishly, but we have the most exciting program planned, and I'm learning about all these things. I mean, this Zoom and YouTube and all of that, I'm an old man, so this is a real catch up for me. But if you go to our website, you can begin registering now. It's going to be exciting, and we're going to have special groups in Spanish. All of it will be translated, so it's going to be quite an exciting event. As I've been saying in English, this ain't your grandmother's webinar. This is going to be a very unique event, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So please go to the Acton Institute, acton.org, and look for Acton University and register now for that seminar.
Okay, thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Y también les recordamos a todos que el Instituto República tiene publicado el libro Las raíces cristianas del libre mercado de Alex Chafuén, donde se aborda precisamente la escuela de Salamanca, y lo pueden adquirir ya sea por la tienda virtual, comunicándose con nosotros, y para poder acceder a este texto que es bastante interesante. Es un libro que fue publicado en conjunto con la Fundación para el Progreso y que tenemos 2 ediciones. Así que los dejo cordialmente invitados también a tomar esa lectura en cuarentena. Y los despedimos, hasta aquí llega esta transmisión y nos vemos en un próximo evento.